Hi guys, tonight we're going to drift softly into the quiet beginnings of a man whose silence changed the world. Before the fame, before the bowler hat, before the cane, there was simply a boy learning to survive. This story will gently explore how Charlie Chaplin became the comedian who spoke without words, shaping cinema with nothing but movement, emotion, and imagination. Now let's slowly step into the earliest shadows of his life, where everything began. But before we begin, for those who enjoy slow, thoughtful stories about legendary figures, hit like, subscribe, and share in the comments which personality or historical figure you'd like me to cover next. And tell me, where are you watching from? I'm always curious to see the different places my viewers are from. Charlie Chaplin's story does not start with applause or bright lights, but with a small boy wandering through the narrow streets of London, learning how to read the world long before he ever learned how to read words. He grew up in a home where money slipped away faster than time, where each day felt like balancing on a thin string that could snap at any moment. His mother, Hannah, was a performer with a soft voice and a delicate presence, and she carried dreams that always seemed just one step ahead of her. His father, Charles Sr., had a talent for entertaining crowds, but his life was tangled with struggles that made stability impossible. From the very beginning, Charlie learned what uncertainty felt like, not as an idea, but as a constant, quiet companion. The streets became his first classroom. He watched how people walked, how they talked, how they laughed at small things just to make the day feel lighter. He noticed how gestures revealed more truth than any sentence, how a raised eyebrow or a hurried shuffle could tell an entire story without a single sound. These early observations settled deep inside him, waiting to grow into something the world had never seen before. Nights in the Chaplin household were unpredictable. Sometimes there was a warm meal, sometimes only silence. Sometimes his mother hummed softly, creating brief islands of calm, and sometimes the weight of the world pressed too heavily on her. Charlie and his older brother, Sidney, learned early on how to hold on to each other when everything else felt uncertain. Even as a child, Charlie had a quiet way of turning pain into imagination. When the house felt cold, he created stories in his mind. When the streets felt rough, he imagined himself as someone who could make people smile. He didn't know yet that this ability, this instinct, would one day make him one of the most recognized faces on earth. Without realizing it, he was building the foundation of a character that would later be known across continents. The Tramp, a figure who stumbled through life with resilience, vulnerability, and gentle humor. But for now, Charlie was simply a boy trying to understand the world through small, careful steps. London in those years was a city of sharp contrasts. The wealthy lived in comfort while countless families struggled to make ends meet. Charlie's childhood belonged firmly to the latter group. He spent many days wandering through neighborhoods where hope and hardship lived side by side, observing how people survived with tiny acts of kindness, sharing food, offering shelter, or simply exchanging a smile at the right moment. These moments taught him that even in difficult times, humanity had a way of shining through the cracks. There were times when Charlie had to fend for himself while his mother battled her own inner storms. These difficult periods shaped his understanding of loneliness, but also of resilience. He learned how to entertain himself, how to bring light into dark corners, how to guide his imagination like a lantern through unfamiliar nights. Everything he lived, every struggle, every moment of stillness, every small discovery, was shaping the artist he would become. He didn't know it yet, but he was collecting the emotional vocabulary that would one day allow him to speak to millions without uttering a single word. His childhood was not easy, but it was filled with the raw materials that would become the heart of his art. Empathy, observation, humour born from hardship, and a profound understanding of human fragility. And so, in the quiet spaces between challenge and hope, the earliest version of Charlie Chaplin began to emerge, step by gentle step. Charlie's early years unfolded like a soft grey mist drifting through the narrow alleys of London, shaping him quietly, patiently, without hurry. After the first hints of hardship settled into everyday life, Charlie began to understand that survival required more than strength. It required creativity. When money ran out, which happened often, he found small ways to distract himself from the hunger that pressed gently but persistently against his thoughts. Sometimes he would mimic the people he saw on the streets, exaggerating their movements just enough to make his brother laugh. Other times he would stand in front of a cracked mirror, watching how his face could stretch into expressions that didn't match how he felt inside. This private game, silent and strangely comforting, became one of his earliest tools for coping with the world around him. His mother, Hannah, though fragile in many ways, had an instinct for performance that Charlie admired deeply. She sang gracefully, even when her voice trembled, and Charlie saw how audiences responded to sincerity more than perfection. He carried that lesson with him. People connect to honesty, even if it comes wrapped in clumsy steps or quiet gestures. But life at home grew more difficult as his mother's health declined. There were days when she drifted away into her own mind, unreachable, and the silence in their small rooms felt heavier than usual. During those moments, Charlie felt a responsibility far greater than his age. He tried to take care of small tasks, helping Sydney keep things together, though both boys understood there was little they could truly fix. Eventually, the instability at home became too overwhelming, and authorities placed Charlie and Sydney in the workhouse. The sudden shift was like stepping into a cold, unfamiliar world, structured, strict, and filled with faces that carried similar stories of struggle. Yet even there, surrounded by routines and rules, Charlie found moments to observe the tiny sparks of humanity that flickered between the children. Some found comfort in drawing, others whispered stories after lights out, some simply held on to memories of home. Charlie, however, held on to movement. He studied how people reacted to unexpected interruptions, a stumble, a dropped bucket, a squeak in the floor. He noticed how laughter could bloom in places where everything else felt grey. He didn't perform intentionally, not yet, but humour followed him naturally, as if it had always been waiting behind his shoulder. When his mother briefly recovered and the boys returned home, Charlie felt a fragile hope. But that period of calm was short-lived. Hannah's health continued to falter, and soon she was admitted to a hospital where she would spend long stretches of time. Charlie visited when he could, sitting beside her quietly, holding on to the fading sense of warmth she brought into his life. Her absence left a space inside him that he didn't know how to fill. Yet even then, even in the heaviness of uncertainty, something inside Charlie remained gentle and observant. He never allowed the hardships of his childhood to harden him. Instead, they softened him, making him more sensitive to the emotions of the people around him. This early training, unplanned and often painful, taught him the small truths of human nature that would later define his silent performances. Every stumble, every smile, every quiet moment of resilience he witnessed became part of an internal library he would draw from for the rest of his life. And though he couldn't see it then, the world was quietly shaping Charlie Chaplin into someone who would one day show millions that laughter could rise even from the most fragile corners of life. Charlie's return to the world outside the workhouse felt like stepping into sunlight after a long stretch of cloudy days. Yet life did not suddenly become easier. London still moved with the same restless rhythm, and Charlie, now slightly older, sensed that he had to carve out a place for himself in it. He wandered through markets, side streets, and small gathering spots, watching performers who stood on makeshift stages or entertained crowds with nothing but quick wit and expressive gestures. These street artists fascinated him. Some juggled, some told stories, and others relied on nothing more than their bodies to make people forget their troubles for a few moments. Charlie studied them quietly from the edges of crowds, noticing how a simple movement could shift the energy of a watching group. A stumble could spark laughter. A slow, thoughtful pause could draw everyone in. A sudden twist or surprised look could make the entire audience lean closer. This silent language made sense to him in a way spoken words never had. During this time, Charlie found occasional work doing small tasks but nothing steady. Money came and went like passing winds, and hunger remained a familiar presence. Yet even on difficult days, he felt drawn toward the world of performance. It wasn't fame he imagined, not yet. but rather the idea that he could make people feel something gentle, something warm, something that eased their worries, even if only for a moment. His brother Sidney played a crucial role in these years. Older, steadier and determined, Sidney worked tirelessly to find opportunities for both of them. He believed Charlie had something special, an inner spark that could grow if given the right stage. Guided by that belief, Sidney helped Charlie join a group of young performers known as the 8 Lancashire Lads. It was Charlie's first true entry into the world of entertainment. The troupe specialised in energetic clog dancing, travelling from place to perform. For Charlie, the experience was both exciting and humbling. He wasn't the strongest dancer, nor the most technically precise, but he understood rhythm in a way that felt natural. More importantly, he understood the audience. While other boys focused solely on the steps, Charlie paid attention to how each movement landed, how the crowd reacted when they smiled, when they shifted in their seats. He began adding tiny touches, small pauses, exaggerated turns, subtle expressions that made people laugh without fully understanding why. These early performances planted a quiet confidence in him. They showed him that even without speaking, he could communicate stories and emotions that reached people of all ages. He learned that silence was not empty. It was a canvas waiting to be filled with meaning. With each show, Charlie's sense of purpose grew a little stronger. The stage, even a small travelling one, felt like a place where he could finally belong, where the hardships of his past transformed into something useful, something that could bring light to others. And though he didn't know it yet, these gentle beginnings would one day lead him toward a world where his quiet steps would echo louder than words ever could. Life with the 8 Lancashire Lads gave Charlie a small sense of direction, but it also showed him how unpredictable the world of performance could be. The troupe travelled often, moving between towns that varied from lively to quiet, from welcoming to indifferent. Some nights the audience responded with warm applause, while other nights the boys danced for people who barely looked up from their seats. Charlie paid close attention to these shifts. He noticed that crowds wanted to feel connected, not just entertained. Even though he wasn't the lead of the group, he treated every performance like a chance to discover something new about how people reacted to movement, rhythm, and emotion. After a while, the routines of clog dancing began to feel limiting to Charlie. He appreciated the discipline it taught him, but his imagination kept drifting beyond the structured steps. He wanted to express more than the precise patterns of the dance allowed. He sensed that there were stories buried inside him. Quiet stories, funny ones, tender ones, and he needed a stage that would let him explore them. As he grew older, he realised he needed to take a risk. Leaving the troupe wasn't easy. It had been his first real home in the performing world, but something within him kept whispering that he was meant for a broader canvas. After parting ways, he began seeking work in theatres, music halls, and any place that might give him even a small role. These early attempts were filled with uncertainty. Sometimes he landed tiny parts, other times he waited backstage only to be turned away. But he never stopped observing everything around him. He watched how seasoned actors carried themselves, how comedians timed their pauses, how the audience leaned forward when a scene felt honest. Charlie learned to read the room the same way he once read the streets of London, quietly, carefully, with curiosity. Eventually he found steady work in small theatre productions. The roles were simple and often short, but they gave him room to experiment. He discovered that even a minor character could shape the mood of a scene if played with sincerity. He also learned that humour wasn't about forcing laughter. It was about revealing something truthful in a gentle, unexpected way. Every night he practiced refining his gestures, adjusting the tilt of his head, the pace of his walk, or the timing of a glance. Audiences began to notice him, even when he didn't speak. They saw something familiar in his expressive eyes and subtle movements, something human. These early performances helped Charlie understand that silence was not a barrier. It was a language. One evening, while preparing backstage, he realised that he didn't need to mimic others or follow their path. His strength came from his own experiences, from the quiet resilience he had carried since childhood. That realization settled into him like a foundation stone, grounding him for everything that would follow. Slowly, steadily, Charlie was becoming an artist who could shape emotion through the simplest gestures, and though he couldn't imagine it yet, this gentle mastery of movement would soon open a door that would change his life forever. Charlie's growing presence on small stages eventually caught the attention of performers who had worked in larger, more established circuits. Word began to spread about the quiet young actor who could make people laugh with the slightest movement, and who carried an unusual blend of vulnerability and charm. Among those who noticed him was Fred Karno, a legendary figure in the world of comedic theatre. Karno was known for discovering raw talent and shaping it into something unforgettable, and when he saw Charlie perform, he recognised a spark that could not be taught. Karno invited him to audition for his company, a troupe famous for high-energy sketches and physical comedy. For Charlie, the invitation felt like a doorway opening into a new and thrilling world. During the audition, he used every ounce of precision he had learned from years of observing people. He timed his movements carefully, letting pauses breathe just long enough to create anticipation. He mixed clumsiness with grace, awkwardness with sincerity, and emotions with honesty. When the room erupted into laughter at moments he had crafted so delicately, Charlie felt something shift inside him. He was finally standing where he belonged. Joining the Karno troupe changed everything. Their schedule was intense, their expectations high, and their rehearsals full of energy. Charlie found himself surrounded by performers who lived and breathed comedy, each one pushing the others to be sharper, funnier, more inventive. At first, he worried that he might not keep up, but those doubts faded quickly, as he realised that his unique style didn't need to match anyone else's. It was enough simply to be himself. Under Karno's guidance, Charlie refined his technique. He learned how to fall convincingly, how to stretch a single moment into something hilarious, and how to use silence as a punchline. He discovered the magic of exaggeration, not as a way to shout for attention, but as a way to magnify simple truths about human nature. The audiences loved him. Charlie's characters were often underdogs, gentle souls stumbling through life with determination and hope. People saw parts of themselves in his performances, and they responded warmly. With each show, his confidence grew. But the real turning point came when the Karno troupe embarked on a tour of the United States. Charlie had never travelled so far from home, and the thought of performing for American audiences filled him with a quiet mix of excitement and uncertainty. America was different. Bigger stages, larger crowds, and a sense of opportunity that felt almost unreal. When Charlie stepped onto an American stage for the first time, he felt the air shift around him. The laughter that rose from the crowd carried a new kind of warmth, a new kind of promise. Something told him that this place, this moment, would shape his future in ways he could not yet imagine. And he was right, because it was in America that the path of silent film would soon cross with his own footsteps, changing his destiny forever. The American tour with the Karno troupe unfolded like a quiet revelation for Charlie, opening doors he hadn't even known existed. The audiences were lively and expressive, reacting with an energy that pushed him to explore new layers of his craft. Night after night he performed in crowded theatres where every laugh, every gasp, and every moment of silence felt amplified. This heightened atmosphere taught him how to fine-tune his timing, how to stretch a pause into something funny, and how to shape small gestures into moments that audiences remembered long after the show ended. Yet even as he embraced the excitement of performing across America, Charlie carried a sense of stillness within him. He often wandered through unfamiliar streets between performances, observing people with the same quiet curiosity he had as a child in London. He noticed how Americans moved differently, how they expressed joy and frustration, how their daily lives were filled with unique rhythms. These observations became part of his growing internal archive of human expression, material he would later transform into the language of silent film. One evening, during a performance that was going particularly well, Charlie felt the audience connect to him with a warmth that surprised him. Their laughter wasn't just amusement, it was recognition. They saw something human in his clumsy elegance, something honest in the way he balanced humour with vulnerability. That night, standing backstage with sweat cooling on his skin, Charlie realised he was experiencing a new kind of possibility, one that extended beyond live theatre. Around this time, silent films were beginning to draw massive crowds across America. Studios were growing quickly, searching for performers who could speak through motion rather than dialogue. When film scouts came to see the Carno troupe, it was only natural that their attention drifted toward the young man whose expressive face could shift from hopeful to heartbroken in an instant. One scout in particular, from Keystone Studios, watched Charlie with increasing interest. He saw a performer whose movements were naturally cinematic, precise, flexible, and rich with emotional clarity. After one performance that left the audience roaring with laughter, the scout approached Charlie with an offer that felt both exciting and unreal, a chance to work in motion pictures. At first, Charlie hesitated. Film was new, unpredictable, and very different from the stage world he knew so well, but something inside him, perhaps the same instinct that had guided him since childhood, told him to step forward. He sensed that film held a future where he could express himself in ways theatre could never fully allow. And so, with quiet determination, Charlie agreed to join Keystone. As he boarded a train that would take him toward this new beginning, he didn't yet grasp how profoundly this choice would shape his life. All he knew was that he was stepping into a world where silence could speak louder than words, and where his gentle, expressive style might finally find the canvas it had always needed. Arriving at Keystone Studios felt like stepping onto a different planet. The air buzzed with activity, actors rushing between sets, directors shouting instructions, cameras cranking in steady rhythms. For Charlie, who had spent years mastering live performance, the world of early cinema looked chaotic and unfamiliar. There were no audiences to respond to, no immediate feedback, only the silent gaze of the camera. Yet beneath the confusion, he sensed opportunity. Max Sennett, the head of Keystone, was known for creating fast-paced slapstick comedies filled with chases, falls, and exaggerated reactions. At first, Charlie struggled to find his place in this environment. His style was subtler, more thoughtful, shaped by years of watching people and reading their emotions. He wasn't used to relying on big gestures or wild stunts to make people laugh. During his early days at the studio, Charlie felt a quiet frustration. He performed the scenes he was given, but they didn't feel entirely natural. He wanted to bring more detail, more nuance, something that reflected the delicate humour he had been developing since childhood. And then, almost by accident, everything changed. One afternoon, while preparing for a scene, Charlie wandered into the costume department. Without thinking too hard, he picked up a pair of oversized pants, a tight coat, a small bowler hat, and a cane. Looking at himself in the mirror, he felt an unexpected sense of familiarity. The figure staring back at him was clumsy but dignified, awkward but determined, a character shaped by life's hardships yet still hopeful. He didn't know it yet, but this would become one of the most iconic figures in cinematic history, the Tramp. When Charlie stepped onto the set in this new costume, something clicked. His movements felt more natural. His expressions flowed effortlessly. The crew immediately sensed something special, though no one could fully explain why. During filming, Charlie experimented with the Tramp's walk, a shuffle that carried both humour and resilience. He played with timing, letting small pauses blossom into big reactions. He discovered that the Tramp moved through the world as an underdog, always trying to maintain dignity even while stumbling through chaos. Max Sennett watched the footage and saw potential. He didn't fully understand the character, but he recognised the spark that audiences might love. He began giving Charlie more opportunities to develop the Tramp in upcoming films. For Charlie, these moments felt like the beginning of a new chapter. The silence of film, which had seemed intimidating at first, became a canvas he could fill with tiny details, each gesture carefully shaped, each expression layered with emotion. The Tramp allowed him to merge comedy with tenderness, clumsiness with heart, and humour with humanity. As the weeks passed, Charlie noticed something stirring within him. For the first time in his life, he felt he had found a character that reflected not just his imagination, but also the struggles, hopes, and fragile moments that had shaped him since childhood. He didn't know where this path would lead, but he sensed he was no longer simply performing. He was beginning to create something truly his own. As Charlie continued developing the Tramp on Keystone sets, he began to understand just how powerful silent storytelling could be. Without spoken dialogue, every movement mattered, every small gesture carried weight. He learned to shape emotions with nothing more than the lift of an eyebrow, the tilt of a hat, or the way he held his cane. Audiences, watching from theatres across the country, connected to these details with surprising intensity. They didn't just laugh at the Tramp, they felt for him. Charlie sensed that this character allowed people to see themselves reflected in a gentle, humorous way. The Tramp stumbled through life with hope, resilience, and a kind of stubborn kindness, and viewers embraced him immediately. Still, early filming at Keystone wasn't always smooth. The fast-paced style of comedy favoured by the studio often clashed with Charlie's desire for precision. Scenes were shot quickly, sometimes without rehearsal, and directors expected actors to improvise with broad, chaotic gestures. Charlie, however, wanted intention. He believed that humour became stronger when rooted in something real, an emotion, a reaction, a tiny truth. His desire for careful control sometimes caused tension with other performers, but Charlie continued pushing quietly for improvements. When he received the chance to direct a short sequence, he poured all his focus into crafting meaningful moments. He spent time adjusting camera angles, refining timing, and choreographing the Tramp's movements until they felt just right. The difference was undeniable. His scenes carried a new level of clarity, a softer humour that lingered. Audiences responded with enthusiasm, and studio executives began noticing the rising star in their midst. Over time, Charlie gained more freedom to shape his own performances. He studied film reels obsessively, watching how small changes could shift an entire scene. He experimented with pacing, discovering that a slight delay before a joke could make it twice as funny. He also learned how to combine emotion and comedy in ways that felt natural. The Tramp didn't just fall or get hit. He reacted with dignity, surprise, or gentle disappointment, making each moment relatable rather than merely silly. As his confidence grew, Charlie felt something deeper awakening within him. For the first time, he wasn't just playing a role, he was creating art. His childhood observations, his years with the Carno troupe, his struggles and his instincts were merging into a distinctive voice that spoke through silence. The Tramp became more than a comedic figure. He became a lens through which Charlie explored humanity. Every film allowed him to show a new facet: loneliness, joy, curiosity, hope. And audiences, even without hearing a single word, understood him completely. Yet even as his popularity increased, Charlie never lost the quiet perspective he carried since his earliest days in London. Fame did not distract him. Instead, it pushed him to work harder, refine more deeply, and honour the trust audiences placed in his performances. Little by little, the young performer who once wandered London streets searching for meaning was becoming one of the most beloved figures in silent cinema. And though he couldn't foresee the scale of his future success, he sensed he was moving towards something extraordinary, something that would shape not just his life, but the entire history of film. As Charlie's reputation grew within Keystone, he began to feel both excitement and a quiet pressure. Audiences were responding to the Tramp with a level of affection he hadn't expected, and with each new film, he sensed a responsibility to deepen the character, rather than repeat the same tricks. He didn't want the Tramp to be just a figure of slapstick chaos. He wanted him to carry heart, dignity, and a sense of humanity that transcended the quick laughs typical of the studio. This desire pushed Charlie to take even greater creative control. He started writing scenes that reflected moments from his own life, small struggles, unexpected kindnesses, the delicate balance between hope and disappointment. He turned simple situations into stories that blended humour and tenderness. A man trying to eat quietly in a crowded cafe, a job that went wrong in a dozen tiny ways, a moment of clumsy romance. These everyday experiences became rich material for the tramp's world. Yet even as Charlie's artistic vision expanded, he understood the importance of discipline. He spent long hours rehearsing alone, perfecting each gesture until it felt effortless. He studied the way people moved on the street, paying attention to their expressions, their gait, their reactions to small inconveniences. To him, every detail mattered. Every choice shaped the emotional truth of the scene. One of the biggest shifts in Charlie's career came when he began directing his own films regularly. Keystone, recognizing his growing talent, allowed him to experiment with creative choices that were unusual for the studio. Charlie slowed down the pacing of scenes, letting moments breathe instead of rushing to the next gag. He used silence intentionally, allowing the audience to absorb emotion before the humour returned. These small changes transformed his films. Viewers felt as though they were watching not just a comedy, but a gentle reflection of life's bittersweet patterns. The tramp's struggles mirrored the everyday experiences of countless people facing hardship, and audiences embraced him with a sense of affection, usually reserved for friends, not fictional characters. Charlie's work began gaining attention far beyond Keystone's usual reach. Critics praised his expressive storytelling, and some wrote that his films carried unexpected warmth, uncommon in slapstick comedy. Children adored the tramp's playful nature, while adults recognized the deeper emotions behind his clumsy charm. Still, Charlie remained humble. He approached each new film with a blend of gratitude and determination, always asking himself how he could improve, how he could refine the emotional balance that defined the tramp. His dedication did not go unnoticed, and soon other studios began reaching out with offers. More money, more freedom, bigger opportunities. Though flattering, these offers also stirred uncertainty in Charlie. He had finally found stability, something rare in his life, yet he sensed that staying too long in one place might limit his growth. Somewhere deep inside, a quiet instinct told him that the next step in his career would require courage. And so, while continuing to work at Keystone, Charlie began imagining what his future could look like beyond its walls. He didn't know it yet, but he was standing at the edge of a decision that would reshape his career, giving him the freedom to build the kind of films he had always dreamed of creating. As Charlie continued working at Keystone, the growing attention from audiences and critics made him realize that he had reached a turning point. He was grateful for everything the studio had given him. The first chance to explore film, the opportunity to develop the tramp, and the steady work that had lifted him out of years of uncertainty. But deep inside, he felt a quiet pull urging him forward. He wanted more creative freedom, more time to shape his stories, more space to explore the emotional depth of the characters he was creating. He sensed that staying at Keystone with its fast-paced improvisational style would eventually limit him. The studio's approach valued speed over precision, quantity over subtlety. Charlie, however, was discovering that his best work came from careful thought, from refining scenes until they carried the perfect balance of humour and heart. And so, when S&A Studios approached him with an offer that included higher pay, more control, and the chance to produce films at a slower, more deliberate pace, Charlie felt a mixture of excitement and nervous anticipation. Changing studios was a risk. Audiences were used to seeing him in a certain way, and he worried that a new environment might challenge the rhythm he had worked so hard to build. Yet the call for creative independence was stronger. He accepted S&A's offer, stepping into a new chapter with both optimism and vulnerability. At S&A, Charlie instantly felt the difference. The studio gave him room to breathe, to craft stories without being rushed, and to shape characters with more nuance. His first few films there reflected this shift. He began exploring emotional tones that Keystone seldom allowed. Moments of quiet longing, subtle romance, and scenes that lingered just a little longer to let the audience feel the depth behind the tramp's cheerful exterior. One of his earlier successes at Essanay, The Tramp, revealed a more complex side of the character. While still filled with humour, the story carried a bittersweet ending that surprised audiences. Charlie realised that people were ready for something deeper. They didn't need the tramp to win. They just needed him to try, to hope, to keep moving forward despite life's challenges. This emotional dimension resonated powerfully with viewers. They weren't just laughing at his missteps. They were rooting for him, feeling connected to the quiet strength behind his clumsy innocence. Working at Essanay also taught Charlie how to build a film from the ground up. He oversaw everything from story ideas to sets, props, and camera angles. He studied editing techniques, learning how each cut shaped the rhythm of a scene. He experimented with structure, sometimes building a story around a single emotional moment rather than a sequence of gags. These experiences solidified his identity not only as an actor, but also as a filmmaker. Away from Keystone's frantic pace, Charlie found clarity. His instincts grew sharper, his vision more focused. Yet as he honed his craft, he sensed once again that another step awaited him. One that would give him even more control, even more room to create the films he imagined most clearly. Essanay had been a crucial bridge, but it was not his final destination. And soon, new possibilities would emerge that would bring him closer to the artistic freedom he craved. Charlie's time at Essanay brought him a renewed sense of purpose, but it also awakened a growing realization. He was only beginning to understand what he was capable of. With each film, he pushed himself further, exploring how silence could be used not only for comedy, but for storytelling at its most emotional. His work began to reveal themes he had carried since childhood: loneliness, hope, resilience, and the small dignity of ordinary people. Audiences felt these layers deeply, even if they could not always explain why. Still, Essanay had its limits. Though the studio gave him more freedom than Keystone, Charlie often felt constrained by the expectations of its executives. They wanted more films, delivered quickly, while Charlie wanted better films, crafted with intention. He worked tirelessly, sometimes rewriting scenes on the spot, sometimes reshooting entire sequences until the emotional tone felt right. His dedication impressed some but frustrated others who prioritized schedules over artistry. As his contract neared its end, other studios began reaching out with offers. Mutual Film Corporation, in particular, made a proposal that stunned the industry. They offered Charlie both an unprecedented salary and a level of creative autonomy rarely granted to any performer. For Charlie, this was more than just a career opportunity. It was a chance to finally express his vision without compromise. After weeks of careful thought, he accepted. The move marked a monumental shift, not just for him, but for the entire landscape of silent film. At Mutual, Charlie received what he had been seeking for years: time, support, and full control over the creative process. The studio built him a dedicated production unit, complete with a team that trusted his instincts and allowed him to work at his own pace. He no longer had to rush through scripts or settle for half-formed ideas. Instead, he could craft each film like a small piece of art. Almost immediately the results showed. His Mutual films became some of the finest comedies of the silent era, works filled with precision, emotion, and genuine warmth. In classics like The Immigrant, he blended humour with social commentary, portraying the hardships faced by newcomers in a way that was heartfelt and universal. In Easy Street, he showed the tramp navigating a rough neighbourhood, using courage and clumsy charm to bring peace to a troubled community. These films demonstrated a maturity that surprised even those who already admired him. The world began to see Charlie not just as a comedian, but as a storyteller with something meaningful to say. Mutual also allowed him to explore rhythm and pacing more deeply. He experimented with choreographed movements, creating scenes that felt almost like silent music. Every gesture was intentional, every pause crafted to evoke emotion. Critics praised the emotional richness of his work, while audiences continued to fill theatres across America and beyond. Yet even in this creative golden period, Charlie remained quiet and grounded. Success didn't erase the memories of hardship. Instead, it motivated him to keep creating stories that honoured the struggles of ordinary people. And somewhere in the midst of this momentum, he felt another shift approaching, an even greater sense of responsibility toward the art of filmmaking. Mutual had given him space to grow, but soon he would yearn for something even larger, the chance to build a studio of his own, where his vision could fully flourish without any boundaries at all. Charlie's years at Mutual were often described as his creative peak, a time when he crafted some of the most memorable short films of the silent era. But for Charlie himself, this period felt less like an arrival and more like a transition, an important chapter that pointed him toward an even greater dream. With full creative control, he discovered how deeply satisfying it was to shape every detail of a film, from the smallest prop to the final edit. He felt connected to his work in a way he never had before, as though each project carried a piece of his soul. Yet he also realized that even with generous freedom, he was still operating within someone else's structure. Mutual was supportive, but it was not his. And Charlie had always been a quiet observer of life, a boy who learned early that stability came not from circumstance, but from building something of your own. This growing desire pushed him to think beyond individual films. He began imagining a space where he could create without compromise, where no deadlines would pressure him, where every story could unfold at its natural pace. Around this time, he also started feeling the physical and emotional effects of his rapid work schedule. Making films at the level he demanded from himself required long days, intense focus, and constant refinement. He wanted the freedom to slow down when necessary, to step back from a project and return only when inspiration felt genuine. The more he considered it, the more he understood that true artistic independence meant owning his own studio. Meanwhile, the world around him was changing. The film industry was expanding rapidly, with new technologies, bigger productions, and a growing appetite for movies that told deeper, more ambitious stories. Audiences were evolving too. They wanted films that moved them emotionally, not just made them laugh. Charlie sensed that the future of cinema would belong to those willing to blend humour with meaning. And he intended to be one of those pioneers. During this period, he built strong friendships with other major figures in the industry, including Douglas Fairbanks and Mary Pickford, performers who shared his frustrations with studio constraints. They often spoke about the importance of creative autonomy, about their dreams of shaping the future of film on their own terms. These conversations planted seeds that would eventually grow into something revolutionary. As his contract with Mutual drew closer to its end, Charlie felt a familiar mix of fear and determination. Leaving the security of a successful studio was a risk, but so had been every major step in his life. From his childhood struggles to his first uncertain days on the American stage, he had always moved forward despite uncertainty. With Mutual, he had proven he could create masterpieces, but now he wanted the chance to build a legacy. When the final days of his contract arrived, Charlie stepped away with gratitude but without hesitation. He knew that something extraordinary was waiting just ahead. He didn't yet know how big this new chapter would be, how deeply it would reshape Hollywood, or how it would allow him to create some of the greatest films ever made. He only knew he was ready to build a place where his imagination could grow without limits, a place that would soon become one of the most iconic studios in the world. When Charlie stepped away from Mutual, he did so with a clear vision forming quietly in his mind. He didn't want just another contract or a slightly bigger studio. He wanted a place where creativity wasn't filtered through business concerns, where stories could grow at their own rhythm, and where his characters could evolve without pressure. At this point, he had become one of the most recognizable figures in entertainment, and his friendships with Douglas Fairbanks, Mary Pickford, and D.W. Griffith were growing stronger. These were people who understood the same challenges, artists navigating a rapidly changing industry, all of them craving autonomy in a world run by producers and financiers. Their conversations became longer, filled with dreams that felt bold yet strangely attainable. They talked about fairness, about owning their work, about protecting the art of filmmaking from becoming simply a business. Slowly the idea took shape. A studio run not by businessmen, but by the artists themselves. But before that dream could materialize, Charlie focused on the immediate task ahead, finding a new path that aligned with his growing ambition. He signed a deal with First National, a major studio willing to offer him the financial means and independence he craved. The agreement allowed him to build his own production facility while making films for their distribution network. This was exactly what Charlie needed. A chance to create without the typical constraints, and a space where every detail, from the script to the editing room, belonged to him. Construction of his studio began soon after. Located on La Brea Avenue in Hollywood, the property was designed to reflect Charlie's desire for calm, simplicity, and efficiency. It was modest compared to some of the grand studios of the era, but it was his. When he first walked through the gates of the nearly finished lot, he felt something he rarely allowed himself: pride. This place represented every step he had taken, every hardship he had endured, every risk he had chosen to face. It was more than a workplace. It was a sanctuary where imagination could breathe. At First National, Charlie began creating films that displayed an even richer emotional depth. A Dog's Life, one of his earliest works under the New Deal, showcased the tramp navigating the struggles of loneliness and survival with the companionship of a stray dog. It was humorous, yes, but also deeply touching, an exploration of connection in a world that often felt overwhelming. Next came Shoulder Arms, a war comedy that surprised audiences with its boldness. Charlie transformed the harsh reality of conflict into a story filled with hope, humour, and resilience. People praised the film for offering comfort during difficult times, proving that comedy could be both healing and meaningful. His most personal film of this era, however, was The Kid. The story of a man caring for an abandoned child resonated with viewers across the world, blending emotional truth with tender humour. It was a reflection of Charlie's own memories, of being a child navigating uncertainty, of longing for security, of discovering strength through love. The Kid cemented his status not just as a comedian, but as a storyteller capable of capturing the complexity of the human experience. As Charlie's creative power grew, so did the industry around him. Hollywood was becoming a global force, and audiences were demanding more ambitious films. But instead of feeling overwhelmed, Charlie felt ready. He had built the foundation he needed, and the world was beginning to realize that he wasn't simply an entertainer. He was an artist shaping the future of cinema, one silent frame at a time. With the success of The Kid, Charlie entered a period of profound creative confidence. His studio on La Brea had become more than a workplace. It was a quiet corner of the world where he could think, experiment, and refine every detail until the story felt honest. Each morning he arrived early, walking slowly across the lot, observing the light, the sounds, the energy of the space he'd built. There was something calming about having complete control over his environment. It allowed him to approach filmmaking not as a task, but as a gentle, thoughtful process. During this time, he began working on more ambitious stories, exploring themes that touched on poverty, inequality, love, and resilience. Charlie believed that comedy had the power to reveal truths about society without speaking loudly. The tramp, with his soft heart and stubborn hope, became a vessel through which Charlie expressed the struggles of ordinary people. Even when the world felt overwhelming, the tramp kept walking, kept trying, kept finding small moments of joy. One of Charlie's most notable projects during the First National years was The Idle Class. In this film, he contrasted two versions of himself, one as the tramp and the other as a wealthy, troubled man. The dual roles allowed him to explore the distance between social classes with humour and sensitivity. He was fascinated by the idea that people who lived in separate worlds could still share the same emotions, fears and desires. But the film that defined this era most clearly was The Gold Rush. Inspired by stories of prospectors seeking fortune in harsh, unforgiving landscapes, Charlie created a tale filled with iconic images. The starving tramp eating a shoe, the cabin teetering on a cliff, the dance of the bread rolls. These scenes became some of the most memorable moments in silent film history, showcasing his ability to blend physical comedy with emotional depth. Throughout the production, Charlie worked with an intensity that bordered on perfectionism. He shot scenes repeatedly, sometimes dozens of times, searching for the exact balance of humour and sincerity he envisioned. Actors and crew members were often amazed by his attention to detail. A small gesture, a momentary glance, or the angle of a hat could lead to an hour-long adjustment. Charlie believed that every frame mattered because every frame spoke. As The Gold Rush neared completion, he felt a sense of fulfillment he hadn't experienced before. The film represented not only his artistic growth, but also his personal journey, a reflection of resilience forged through hardship. When audiences finally saw the movie, their reaction confirmed everything Charlie had hoped. People laughed, cried, and connected deeply with the tramp's struggles. The film became a global success, praised for its originality, warmth, and emotional resonance. Yet even in the glow of triumph, Charlie remained reflective. He knew that filmmaking was changing rapidly. Technology was evolving, and the industry was beginning to whisper about a new era, one where sound would soon enter the world of cinema. Charlie sensed that this shift would challenge everything he had built, but he also trusted his instincts, the same instincts that had guided him from the crowded streets of London to the centre of Hollywood. He wasn't afraid of change, he simply wanted to move toward it carefully, thoughtfully, and at his own pace. As The Gold Rush solidified Charlie's place as a true master of silent cinema, the industry around him began to shift in ways that felt both exciting and unsettling. The introduction of synchronized sound, first seen in a handful of experimental films, was quickly becoming the center of Hollywood's attention. Studios rushed to adapt, investing in new equipment, new stages, and new styles of performance. Audiences were fascinated by the novelty of hearing actors speak on screen. For many filmmakers, sound represented the future, a natural evolution that promised bigger crowds and greater spectacle. But for Charlie, the change felt far more complicated. Silence had always been his canvas. Through silence, he had learned to speak with pure emotion, to communicate across cultures and languages, to make audiences laugh and ache with nothing but movement and expression. The idea of adding spoken dialogue felt like stepping into a world where part of his voice might be lost. Still, he did not dismiss the new technology. Charlie observed carefully, attending demonstrations and screenings, analysing how other directors used sound. He noticed that many early talkies felt stiff, their performances weighed down by the limitations of microphones and the novelty of dialogue. Actors who once moved freely now stood rooted to the spot, speaking lines instead of expressing emotions through the body. To Charlie, this shift threatened the universality that had made silent films so powerful. As he considered his next move, he began working on The Circus, a film that would become one of his most difficult to create. Plagued by setbacks, including a studio fire, legal disputes and personal turmoil, Charlie nevertheless approached the project with his usual dedication. The story followed the tramp as he stumbled into a circus troupe and unintentionally became their star performer. It was a film filled with physical danger, intricate choreography, and moments of deep vulnerability. Even amid the chaos of production, Charlie found solace in the familiar language of silent performance. He worked tirelessly, refining each sequence until the timing felt effortless. When The Circus was finally released, audiences embraced it warmly. They praised the humour, the heart, and the delicate balance of emotion that had become Charlie's signature. The film earned him a special Academy Award for versatility and genius, a recognition that acknowledged his extraordinary influence on the medium. Yet behind the scenes, Charlie felt a growing tension. Hollywood was now fully embracing sound, and silent films were rapidly disappearing from theatres. The world he had helped define was changing before his eyes. Some urged him to adapt quickly, to cast aside the tramp and step into the era of talkies, but Charlie believed that rushing into sound would betray the artistic principles he valued most. He wanted time to think, time to experiment, time to decide whether the tramp could survive in a world filled with voices. As he walked across his studio lot late at night, the quiet felt heavier than before. The future of cinema was calling, loud and insistent, and Charlie knew he would have to answer eventually. But he also knew one thing with absolute certainty. Whatever choice he made would come from the same place that had guided him from the beginning. His heart, his instinct, and his unwavering belief that film was a universal language, one that transcended words. In the years following the circus, Charlie found himself standing at a crossroads unlike any he had faced before. Silent cinema, the world that had shaped him, lifted him, and carried his voice across continents, was fading with astonishing speed. Everywhere he looked, studios were shifting their resources to sound stages, actors were practicing scripted lines, and directors were embracing the possibilities of dialogue. Hollywood felt noisier than ever, buzzing with excitement for this new era. And yet, in the middle of this transformation, Charlie felt an unusual calm. He wasn't rushing toward change, nor was he resisting it blindly. Instead, he stepped back and observed the landscape with thoughtful eyes, much like he had done as a young boy studying the movements of strangers on London streets. He wanted to understand, not react. During this period of reflection, he began writing and planning a new project that would become City Lights. It was a love story, a comedy, a gentle exploration of loneliness and compassion. But most importantly, it was a silent film crafted in a world that had already declared silence outdated. Many people warned him that audiences would reject it. They insisted that moviegoers now wanted voices, songs, and sound effects. But Charlie trusted his instincts. He believed the power of silent storytelling had not disappeared. Emotion, after all, did not rely on spoken words, and the tramp, his beloved character, belonged to the quiet world where expressions, gestures, and small moments spoke louder than dialogue ever could. Still, making City Lights was not easy. Sound technology had already changed the way films were shot. Cameras were now enclosed in bulky soundproof booths that restricted movement and made scenes harder to frame. Even though Charlie wasn't using dialogue, he still had to navigate this new environment, finding ways to preserve the fluidity of his visual storytelling. Day after day, he worked with intense focus, adjusting scenes until they matched the rhythm he imagined. He spent long nights refining the script, perfecting the emotional arc, and shaping the relationship between the tramp and the blind flower girl, a tender bond that would become one of the most beloved stories in cinema. Some days, doubt crept into the studio. Crew members wondered whether audiences would connect to a film without spoken words when everything else in Hollywood now burst with sound. But Charlie remained steady. He poured his heart into every frame, trusting that sincerity would reach people no matter the era. He believed that human connection, gentle, fragile, and universal, transcended trends. When filming grew complicated, Charlie reminded himself that his greatest achievements had always come from following his own vision, even when others doubted him. And so he kept going, scene by scene, gesture by gesture, shaping a film that blended humour with melancholy, simplicity with emotional depth. As City Lights neared completion, Charlie felt a quiet certainty that he had created something meaningful. He didn't know how the world would react, but he knew the film carried truth, his truth, and the enduring spirit of the tramp. And soon he would discover that even in an era filled with sound, silence still had the power to move millions. When City Lights finally premiered in 1931, the atmosphere in the theatre carried a mix of curiosity and uncertainty. Many wondered whether a silent film could survive in a world now dominated by sound. Yet from the moment the first scene flickered onto the screen, something remarkable happened. The audience fell quiet, not with confusion, but with focus. They leaned in, drawn by the familiar shuffle of the tramp, the gentle rhythm of his movements, and the sincerity in every gesture. Charlie watched from the side, his heart steady but alert. He knew how much he had risked by creating a silent film in a sound era. But as laughter began to spread across the theatre, followed by soft sighs and muffled sniffles, he realized his instinct had been right. The emotions carried through every frame, untouched by time or technology. When the final scene arrived, the tramp standing uncertainly before the flower girl as she recognized him, the theatre held its breath. It was a moment built entirely on silence, a trembling hand, a hopeful smile, a flicker of understanding. And yet it spoke louder than any dialogue could. By the time the credits rolled, the audience rose in a wave of applause. Some people cried openly, others simply stood, unsure how to express the depth of what they had felt. Charlie, moved by their response, remained hidden in the shadows of the theatre, quietly grateful. He had followed his heart against the current, and the world had embraced it. Critics praised City Lights, calling it a masterpiece of silent storytelling, in an era that had almost forgotten the art. They admired Charlie's refusal to abandon the emotional clarity that silence allowed. The film became not just a success, but a testament to the enduring power of visual expression. Yet even in triumph, Charlie felt the world changing around him. Talkies were no longer a novelty, they were the standard. Studios released musicals, dramas and comedies with lively dialogue, and audiences flocked to hear voices that had once been silent. Charlie understood that he couldn't remain in the past forever, but he also knew he wouldn't allow the tramp to speak unless it truly served the story. He believed that giving the tramp a voice might break the delicate connection audiences had with him. The tramp belonged to a world where emotions lived in gestures, not words. Still, Charlie wasn't afraid of change. He simply approached it thoughtfully. After City Lights, he began exploring how sound could enhance his films without compromising their essence. He experimented with music, sound effects, and subtle audio cues that supported the story while maintaining the purity of visual performance. During this time, Charlie also faced personal challenges. His fame, which had brought him great success, also brought scrutiny. Reporters followed his every move, and the pressures of public attention weighed heavily on him. Yet whenever he returned to his studio, he found peace in the work itself. Creating films remained his refuge, a place where noise faded and only the language of storytelling remained. As he considered his next project, Charlie felt a familiar mixture of uncertainty and excitement. The world of cinema was evolving rapidly, and he knew he would have to evolve with it. But he also felt a quiet confidence. He had navigated hardship before, and each time he had emerged with a clearer sense of who he was as an artist. Now, standing on the edge of a new era, he prepared once more to follow his instincts, trusting that sincerity and heart would guide him through the changing landscape of film. After the sweeping success of City Lights, Charlie felt both reassured and challenged. He had proven that silence could still captivate audiences, but he also recognized that the world was moving quickly towards sound. If he wanted to continue telling stories on a grand scale, he needed to find a way to integrate this new technology without sacrificing the emotional clarity that defined his work. With this in mind, Charlie began developing a new film, one that would push his artistic boundaries and allow him to explore sound in a meaningful, controlled way. This project would become Modern Times, a satirical look at industrialization and the pressures of the rapidly changing world. At first, Charlie considered making it a full talkie, but every time he imagined the tramp speaking actual dialogue, something felt wrong. The tramp existed in a universal realm, without language, without borders, without the constraints of specific words. Giving him a voice felt like defining him too narrowly, limiting the connection audiences had formed with him. And so, Charlie made a bold decision. Modern times would be mostly silent, but with carefully placed sound effects and a few moments of synchronized audio that enhanced rather than replaced the visual storytelling. He used sound as texture, not as the core of the film. One of the most memorable examples was the nonsense song the tramp performs near the end. Instead of giving him real words, Charlie wrote a playful tune made entirely of gibberish, a deliberate choice that preserved the character's universality. Audiences could laugh, follow the rhythm, feel the moment, without the tramp ever committing to a single language. As production began, Charlie threw himself into the project with renewed focus. He studied the rise of factory work, the pressures of modern society, and the increasing pace of life that left many feeling overwhelmed. He wanted modern times to reflect the world people were living in, frantic, noisy, and filled with challenges that often felt dehumanizing. The opening scenes showing the tramp caught in the gears of a massive machine became iconic. Charlie spent hours choreographing the movements, ensuring each gesture blended humor with subtle social commentary. He wanted audiences to laugh, but also to recognize the truth behind the jokes. As filming continued, Charlie also allowed himself to explore deeper emotional themes, particularly through the character of the gamin, played by Paulette Goddard. She brought a spirited warmth to the role, and their on-screen connection added another layer of tenderness to the film. Together, the tramp and the gamin represented resilience, the ability to keep going, even when the world felt overwhelming. When Modern Times was released in 1936, reactions were mixed at first. Some critics believed silent films were outdated, while others praised Charlie's courage in resisting trends. But audiences embraced the film wholeheartedly. They understood its message, felt its humour, and connected to its warmth. For many, it became one of Charlie's most beloved works. Yet the film also marked a turning point. Modern Times was the last appearance of the tramp. Charlie realised that the world was changing too quickly for the character to exist untouched. He felt it was better to let the tramp walk into the sunset with dignity, rather than force him into a future that didn't fit. As Charlie watched the final cut, he felt both sadness and gratitude. The tramp had carried him through hardship, through uncertainty, through the rise of Hollywood. But now, it was time for something new. Standing in his studio, listening to the quiet hum of modern equipment, Charlie prepared to take his next brave step into a fully spoken world where his voice would finally be heard. Stepping beyond the tramp was both liberating and daunting for Charlie. For more than 2 decades, that quiet, gentle figure had been his artistic voice, his companion, and his shield. Letting him go meant entering an unfamiliar world, one where Charlie could no longer rely on silence to speak for him. Instead, he would have to use his own voice, shaped by years of observation, thought, and artistic growth. As he considered his next project, Charlie felt an increasing awareness of the turbulent world around him. The 1930s were marked by political tension, economic hardship, and the rise of authoritarian regimes. He watched newsreels that showed massive rallies, aggressive speeches, and the dangerous momentum of ideas fueled by fear. Something in him stirred, a mix of concern, frustration, and responsibility. He believed cinema had the power not only to entertain, but to shed light on painful truths. This belief led him to begin writing what would become The Great Dictator, his first fully spoken film and one of the boldest projects ever undertaken by a filmmaker. The decision was not easy. Many warned him that parodying political leaders, especially Adolf Hitler, was risky, potentially damaging to his career and even dangerous. But Charlie felt compelled to act. The resemblance between the tramp's silhouette and Hitler's appearance had already been noted by others, and Charlie saw an opportunity to use humour as a weapon against cruelty. If laughter could reveal the absurdity of tyranny, perhaps people would see the truth more clearly. As he developed the script, Charlie explored a dual role, a humble Jewish barber and a ruthless dictator named Adenoid Hinkle. The contrast allowed him to examine humanity from opposite extremes, one character defined by compassion, the other by power. Filming began in 1939, just as the world was plunging into war. The atmosphere on set was tense but energized. Charlie approached the project with deep seriousness, balancing satire with emotional weight. He choreographed scenes that pushed comedy to its limits, a dictator dancing with a giant globe, soldiers marching in chaotic formation, but also moments of profound vulnerability. The barber's quiet kindnesses, his struggles, and his hope for peace anchored the story in sincerity. Making a full talkie demanded new skills from Charlie. He experimented with pacing, inflections, and the emotional rhythm of spoken lines. He discovered that dialogue, when used thoughtfully, could carry the same honesty as silent gestures. The film's final speech became the heart of the project, a direct, earnest plea for humanity, freedom, and compassion. Charlie agonized over every sentence, rewriting it until it expressed exactly what he felt about the world's crisis. When The Great Dictator premiered in 1940, it sparked intense reactions. Some praised it as courageous and timely, others called it controversial. But audiences around the world were moved, especially by the closing message. Many wrote to Charlie saying that his words gave them hope in a time of fear. For Charlie, the film represented a turning point. It showed that he could evolve, that he could speak not just through silence but through voice, without losing the sincerity that defined his work. Yet he also understood that the world he now stepped into would be more complex, more political, and less forgiving. Still, he felt ready. With the tramp behind him and his own voice finally emerging, Charlie prepared to explore new artistic territory, guided, as always, by conscience, curiosity, and a deep belief in the power of storytelling. The impact of The Great Dictator echoed far beyond Hollywood, and Charlie felt the weight of what he had created. For the first time, he had stepped onto the screen not as the tramp, but as a man speaking directly to the world. His closing speech, filled with urgency and hope, reached audiences across countries divided by war. Yet with praise also came scrutiny. Some political groups criticized him, accusing him of overstepping, while others applauded his courage. Charlie tried not to dwell on the controversy. He had spoken from the heart, guided by a deep belief that cinema could inspire compassion even in the darkest moments. After the intensity of the film, Charlie longed for a quieter project, something more personal, more intimate. He turned his attention to Monsieur Verdoux, a dark comedy inspired by the idea that desperate circumstances could push ordinary people into extraordinary actions. The film followed a former bank clerk who resorts to marrying and murdering wealthy women to support his family. It was a bold departure from his earlier work, filled with sharper satire and moral complexity. Charlie approached the story with a delicate balance, showing how society itself could drive someone to the edge. He infused the film with moments of humour, charm, and unsettling clarity, forcing audiences to examine their own judgments. But Monsieur Verdoux arrived at a time when public sentiment was shifting. The world had just emerged from the trauma of war, and many viewers were not ready for a story that blended charm with darkness. Critics were divided. Some praised its daring brilliance, others condemned it as insensitive or inappropriate. Charlie accepted the mixed reaction with calm understanding. He knew he had taken a risk. He knew the film had pushed boundaries. And he also knew that artists could not grow by repeating familiar patterns. Still, the criticism stung more deeply than he liked to admit. Hollywood was changing rapidly. and the same voice that had once captivated millions now seemed to attract controversy simply by speaking. Determined to keep moving forward, Charlie began his next film, Limelight, a project rooted in nostalgia and personal memory. Set in London, it followed an aging comedian facing the end of his career as he struggled to help a young dancer rediscover hope. The story felt close to Charlie's heart, perhaps more than any he had ever told. Through the character of Calvero, he explored themes of aging, relevance, and the disappearing world of vaudeville. Writing the script was both comforting and painful. It forced Charlie to confront the passing of time, the loss of youth, and the fragile nature of artistic fame. As filming progressed, he poured his emotions into every scene, shaping a story that was gentle, reflective, and deeply human. Limelight was not just a film. It was a farewell to the world that had made him who he was, and a love letter to the performers who had inspired him as a child. Yet even as he worked, external pressures mounted. Political tensions, personal accusations, and public misunderstandings were beginning to cloud his life. Though he continued to focus on his craft, a quiet storm was forming on the horizon, one that would soon change the course of his life in ways he could not yet imagine. As Limelight neared completion, Charlie sensed that it carried more than artistic weight. It carried emotional truth. The story of an aging performer struggling to stay relevant reflected his own fears, though he rarely admitted it out loud. He poured himself into the role of Calvero, capturing both the humour and the hidden sadness of a man who once made crowds roar with laughter, but now performed to empty rooms. For Charlie, the film became a mirror, one that showed not only the passage of time, but also the enduring value of kindness, mentorship, and quiet resilience. When Limelight was released in 1952, it received praise for its sincerity and emotional depth. Yet, despite its artistic strength, the film struggled in the United States. Political tension had grown during the post-war years, and Charlie found himself at the centre of controversy. Accusations, many unfounded and fueled by suspicion, cast a shadow over his reputation. Critics who once celebrated him now questioned his loyalty, his beliefs, and even his character. Public opinion was divided, and the climate of fear made it difficult for audiences to embrace his work. For Charlie, the shift was painful. He had always seen himself as an entertainer, not a political figure, and the harshness of the criticism felt bewildering. The quiet refuge he once found in his studio no longer felt safe. During this time, he decided to take his family to London for the premiere of Limelight. It was meant to be a temporary trip, a chance to reconnect with the city of his childhood. But while he was at sea, the US government revoked his permit to re-enter the country. The decision struck him with unexpected force. America had been his home for decades, the place where he built his career, raised his children, and created films that touched millions. Being barred from returning felt not just like a political act, but like a personal rejection. Standing on the deck of the ship as it crossed the Atlantic, Charlie quietly absorbed the reality of his new situation. He was now effectively exiled from the country that had shaped his life's work. Yet, even in the midst of disappointment, he refused to let bitterness take root. He reminded himself of everything he had achieved, everything he had given to audiences through stories of hope, humour, and humanity. If the world had changed, he would adapt, as he always had. Charlie relocated with his family to Switzerland, settling in a peaceful home near Lake Geneva. The calm landscape, far from Hollywood's noise and tension, gave him space to breathe, reflect, and heal. Though separated from the industry he helped build, he continued writing, thinking, and observing with the same curiosity he carried since childhood. Limelight, meanwhile, slowly gained the appreciation it deserved. Audiences around the world discovered its tenderness, its wisdom, and its quiet beauty. The film's message, that even when applause fades, kindness and courage remain, resonated deeply with viewers of every generation. and as Charlie looked toward the future, he felt a steady determination forming within him once again. Exile had taken him from Hollywood, but it had not taken away his voice, his vision, or his creative spirit. There were still stories he wanted to tell, ideas he wanted to explore, and a lifetime of experiences waiting to unfold in the peaceful years ahead. Life in Switzerland brought Charlie a kind of peace he hadn't known for many years. The quiet countryside, the serene reflection of Lake Geneva, and the rhythm of family life helped him slowly rebuild a sense of stability. Far from the pressures of Hollywood and the scrutiny of the American press, he found himself reconnecting with the simple joys that had always inspired his creativity: music, reading, long walks, and observing the subtle details of everyday life. Though he missed filmmaking, he did not rush into a new project. Instead, he allowed himself to rest, to breathe, and to understand what this new chapter meant. For decades, his life had been shaped by constant work, writing, directing, performing, editing. Now, for the first time in years, he had the luxury of time. During these reflective months, Charlie began writing again, exploring ideas without deadlines or expectations. His curiosity remained as alive as ever. He sketched story outlines, drafted memoirs, and composed music, discovering that creativity did not disappear with distance, it simply changed shape. Slowly, a new idea began to form, one that blended mystery, dark humour, and social commentary. This would eventually become A King in New York, a satirical look at American culture, celebrity, and political paranoia. In this film, Charlie examined the society that had once celebrated him and later turned against him. He approached the subject not with anger, but with a mischievous wit and thoughtful perspective. Filming took place in Europe, and though the production was smaller than his earlier Hollywood projects, Charlie approached it with the same care he had always given his work. Playing the role of King Shadov, a monarch forced into exile, Charlie infused the character with empathy and quiet humour, reflecting his own experiences without turning the story into a personal attack. The film portrayed the absurdities of fame, the risks of gossip, and the dangers of political fear, a mirror held up to the world he had left behind. While many European audiences appreciated its sharp intelligence, the film was less embraced in America, where Charlie's name remained controversial. Still, he remained at peace with his artistic choices. He had made the film he wanted to make, in the way he believed it should be made. After completing A King in New York, Charlie turned his focus inward once more. He spent time with his growing family, wrote music for several of his older films, and began working on his autobiography. Writing about his childhood, his rise in entertainment, and the evolution of his craft proved both emotional and illuminating. The process allowed him to revisit memories he had long kept tucked away, moments of poverty, resilience, creativity, and triumph. It also reminded him how far he had come, and how each hardship had shaped him into the artist he became. As the years passed, Charlie realized that aging, while challenging, also brought a unique clarity. He no longer felt the need to prove himself. Instead, he wanted to reflect, to understand, and to share the wisdom he had gained through a life lived with passion and purpose. Switzerland became a quiet sanctuary for his final act, a place where he could appreciate each day without the noise of the world pulling at him. And although he was far from Hollywood, his influence continued to ripple outward. Film students studied his work, audiences rediscovered his classics, directors referenced his storytelling techniques. Charlie had built a legacy strong enough to transcend borders, time, and even silence. He knew he might never return to America, but he also knew that in every frame of film he had ever created, a part of him would remain. As the quiet years in Switzerland unfolded, Charlie found himself entering a phase of thoughtful reflection. Surrounded by calm landscapes, he began to see his life as a long, winding story, one filled with triumphs, setbacks, creativity, and constant reinvention. The world had changed dramatically since his early days on the London stage. but his curiosity remained unshaken. Even in his 60s, he continued to observe life with the same attentive eye he'd held as a child, noticing small gestures, emotional nuances, and the subtle humour hidden in everyday moments. During this period, Charlie devoted considerable time to music, an art form he had always loved. Though many people knew him primarily as a filmmaker and performer, music had quietly shaped much of his work. He composed themes for several of his older films, giving them new life through orchestration. Working on these scores allowed him to reconnect with the emotional heart of each story, layering them with tones and melodies that deepen their meaning. Music became a gentle refuge, a creative space free from public opinion or cinematic pressure. He also continued writing his autobiography, pouring decades of memories onto the page with honesty and introspection. Revisiting his childhood hardships proved difficult at times, but it also reminded him of the resilience that had carried him from poverty to global recognition. The pages told not just the story of his rise in cinema, but the story of a man who had navigated uncertainty, loss, reinvention, and the constant pursuit of artistic truth. Fans and scholars eagerly awaited each chapter, seeing it as a rare window into the mind of an artist who had shaped the very language of film. As Charlie grew older, the world around him slowly began to shift in its perception of his legacy. The political controversies that once overshadowed his name started to fade. Younger generations, discovering his films for the first time, saw only the brilliance, the timeless humour, the emotional depth, and the innovative storytelling that defined his work. Film festivals celebrated his contributions, museums curated exhibits dedicated to his artistry, and newspapers revisited his career with renewed respect. One of the most touching developments came with the belated recognition of limelight in the United States. Though the film had initially struggled, it finally received the attention it deserved when it was re-released years later. The Academy of Motion Picture Arts and Sciences awarded the film's score an Oscar, granting Charlie an honour that arrived unexpectedly late in his life. The award symbolised something deeper, a quiet acknowledgement, from the very industry that once held him at arm's length, that his work had always been extraordinary. Despite these late recognitions, Charlie remained humble. Fame had never been what motivated him. What mattered most was the creation itself, the process of shaping a moment, a gesture, a story. He valued the sincerity of art over applause, the emotional truth over popularity. Even as his health began to decline, he spent time surrounded by family, sharing stories, laughing, and savouring the peaceful rhythm of his days. In his home overlooking the lake, he would often sit by the window, watching the shifting light on the water. Sometimes he wrote, sometimes he sketched story ideas, and sometimes he simply allowed himself to rest. A life of relentless creativity had earned him that calm, and though he knew his time in the world was growing shorter, he also knew that his work, his characters, his stories, his silent language of emotion would continue to live on long after he was gone. In the peaceful rhythm of his later years, Charlie found a gentle comfort in watching his children grow. His home in Switzerland was filled with laughter, music, and the small joys that come from family life. The quiet mornings often began with the sound of piano keys being tested by young fingers, or the soft footsteps of children wandering through the halls. Charlie cherished these moments deeply. After a lifetime spent under the bright lights of the world, he found that the simplest scenes, his children playing in the garden, his wife reading by the window, the echo of shared stories at the dinner table, brought him the most profound sense of happiness. Though he no longer worked at the pace he once did, creativity still pulsed through him. He wrote essays, sketched ideas, and occasionally brainstormed film concepts just for the pleasure of imagining them. Even when he wasn't actively making movies, his mind continued to craft stories. Sometimes he would share these ideas with his children, who listened wide-eyed as he described characters who stumbled into mischief, found unexpected hope, or uncovered humour in the smallest corners of life. His family became his most intimate audience, offering the kind of quiet appreciation that had nothing to do with fame. Meanwhile, the world outside his home continued to rediscover his legacy. Film historians wrote essays exploring the symbolism in his work. Universities screened his films for new generations of students, and international festivals held retrospectives honouring his contribution to cinema. Charlie watched these developments from afar with humility. He never viewed himself as a genius or a legend. He saw himself simply as someone who loved telling stories, someone who had used his own hardships to create characters that made people feel less alone. One of the most emotional moments of this period came when he revisited some of his earliest films. Sitting in a small screening room in his home, he watched the tramp shuffle onto the screen, hopeful, determined, clumsy, and full of heart. The character felt like an old friend returning after a long journey. Charlie smiled softly as he remembered the challenges of those early days, the long hours, the uncertainty, the fragile confidence that had slowly grown into mastery. He also reflected on how much the world had changed since those silent black and white scenes first flickered to life. Yet despite decades of evolution in cinema, the essence of the tramp still resonated. People continued to laugh at his quirks, to root for him in his struggles, and to feel the warmth of his sincerity. That enduring connection reminded Charlie of something he had always believed: true emotion never becomes outdated. As the seasons changed along Lake Geneva, Charlie spent more time reflecting on his journey. He often wrote letters to old friends in the film industry, exchanging stories and memories. Some of his colleagues had passed away, others had retired, and still others had faded from public attention. But the bonds they shared, shaped through years of collaboration, challenge, and creativity, remained meaningful to him. He also continued to receive letters from fans around the world. Many wrote to say that his films had comforted them during difficult times, that the tramp had helped them feel hope, or that they had shared his movies with their children and grandchildren. These messages touched Charlie deeply. He knew how powerful art could be, but hearing how his work had woven itself into the lives of strangers filled him with quiet gratitude. Though he lived far from Hollywood's clamour, Charlie never felt disconnected from his audience. His connection, built on shared laughter and unspoken understanding, remained strong across oceans and decades. And as he grew older, he found great comfort in knowing that the stories he'd created would continue to travel through time, bringing warmth to people he would never meet. As Charlie entered his final decade, the world seemed to grow softer around him. His once restless spirit settled into a gentle rhythm shaped by family, reflection, and the comforting passage of quiet days. In the evenings, he often sat near the fireplace with a notebook in his lap, jotting down memories, observations, or bits of dialogue that drifted into his mind like distant echoes from an old stage. Sometimes he wrote only a sentence or two, sometimes a full story poured out effortlessly. Creativity had become a companion rather than a demand. Even though he was no longer making films, the storyteller within him never stopped breathing. His home became a gathering place, not for celebrities or journalists, but for the people he loved most. His children often invited friends over, and Charlie delighted in watching them discover his films for the first time. Their laughter, pure, spontaneous, unfiltered, reminded him why he had chosen this path so many years ago. He had always believed that joy was one of the strongest bridges between people, and hearing children laugh at the tramp's misadventures felt like a quiet confirmation that his work still held meaning. Despite the peace of his life in Switzerland, Charlie occasionally felt moments of melancholy. Age arrived with both grace and heaviness. His body grew slower, his steps more careful, and his once rigorous routines became shorter and simpler. But his mind remained bright. He continued discussing ideas with friends, debating art with his older children, and analysing the films he watched with a thoughtful eye. When younger filmmakers wrote to ask for advice, he replied with kindness, encouraging them to follow their instincts and trust emotion over spectacle. He believed that true storytelling lived in sincerity, not in trends. One of the greatest honours of his later years came when his work began receiving renewed appreciation. Cinematheques around the world organised Chaplin retrospectives. Scholars wrote books examining the depth of his performances, the precision of his directing, and the cultural significance of the tramp. Film students studied his scenes frame by frame, marvelling at the timing, the psychology, and the artistry behind each gesture. Charlie read these analyses with humility. He never saw himself the way others described him. To him, he had simply lived a life guided by curiosity, empathy, and the desire to create something honest. But seeing new generations discover meaning in his films touched him deeply. He realised that the stories he once created in moments of personal struggle had grown into something much larger, a shared language of humanity. His family often encouraged him to rest, but Charlie remained quietly active. He enjoyed slow walks along the lake, where the mountains reflected in the calm water and the sound of birds carried through the crisp air. These walks became times of meditation. He thought about his mother, his brother Sidney, his early days on London streets, the chaos of Hollywood, the laughter of audiences, and the long journey that had led him to this peaceful corner of the world. Occasionally journalists visited Switzerland hoping to interview him. Charlie chose carefully whom to speak with, preferring conversations rooted in genuine interest rather than sensationalism. When he did accept an interview, he spoke softly, choosing his words with care. He reflected on art, life, resilience, and the strange balance between success and solitude. Even now his presence commanded attention, not because he sought it, but because he carried a lifetime of experience with quiet dignity. As the years passed, Charlie became increasingly aware of the legacy he would leave behind. Not the fame, not the awards, but the deeper truth woven through his work, that humour and compassion could coexist, that vulnerability could be a strength, and that silence could speak volumes. And in those quiet moments by the window, watching the sun settle behind the Swiss hills, he felt grateful. Grateful for the journey, the people who believed in him, the audiences who embraced him, and the enduring magic of storytelling that had carried him from darkness into light. In his final years, Charlie moved through life with a gentle awareness of time, carrying a softness that only comes from having lived through extraordinary highs and profound lows. His days followed a calm rhythm. Mornings often began with sunlight spilling across his study table, where stacks of handwritten pages, sketches, and half-finished melodies waited patiently. Though he no longer pushed himself with the urgency of youth, he still felt a quiet joy each time inspiration visited him. Writing had become less about producing something for the world, and more about savouring the act itself, remembering moments, shaping thoughts, and letting memory drift into reflection. He spent many afternoons watching his younger children play in the garden, their laughter floating through the open windows like music. Sometimes he joined them, moving slowly but with unmistakable warmth. To them, he wasn't a global icon. He was simply their father, a man who told wonderful stories, performed silly faces, and had a remarkable ability to turn even the smallest accident into a moment of humour. These simple joys filled Charlie with gratitude, grounding him in a world far removed from the pressures of fame. As he aged, letters continued to arrive from every corner of the globe. Fans wrote to thank him for the comfort his films had brought during difficult moments. A lonely child who found hope in the tramp's resilience, a grieving parent who rediscovered laughter, a young filmmaker who discovered the power of silence through Charlie's work. He read these messages slowly, often pausing to absorb the sincerity behind each word. Though the world had once turned its back on him, these letters reminded him that art lives far longer than controversy. They were proof that his stories had travelled across borders, languages, and generations, touching people in ways he could never have predicted. In quieter moments, Charlie reflected on how deeply cinema had changed since he first stepped in front of a camera. Sound, colour, technique and scale had evolved beyond anything he could have imagined in his early days on the London stage. Yet despite all this progress, he felt comforted knowing that his silent films still held their place in the world. They remained timeless because they spoke the language of human emotion, a language that never grew old. Health challenges slowly appeared, as they do in every long life. Charlie walked more carefully, rested more often, and spent longer hours seated by the window overlooking the lake. But even as his body weakened, his mind remained clear, bright, and curious. He continued to read voraciously, discuss ideas with visitors, and watch films with an analytical eye. He never lost the instinct to learn. Those who visited him in these later years often remarked on his gentleness, his thoughtful pauses, his soft humour, and the way his eyes seemed to hold both wisdom and mischief. Charlie spoke more quietly now, but every word carried the weight of experience. He talked about the importance of empathy, the responsibility of artists, and the beauty of finding connection in unexpected places. He rarely spoke about regrets. Instead, he chose to remember the perseverance that carried him from poverty to artistry, the kindness of those who helped him when he had nothing, and the miracle of a career built on turning hardship into laughter. And as winter settled over Switzerland each year, Charlie often sat with a blanket round his shoulders, gazing out at the snow-covered hills. In those peaceful evenings he felt a profound contentment, a sense that his life, with all its twists and turns, had unfolded exactly as it was meant to. As the seasons continued their gentle cycle around his Swiss home, Charlie found himself embracing the quiet with a sense of fulfillment that felt almost luminous. His life, once defined by constant movement and creative urgency, had softened into a peaceful rhythm where each day carried its own quiet meaning. He spent long stretches of time near the window, watching clouds drift slowly over Lake Geneva. The water reflected the changing sky, sometimes bright, sometimes grey, and Charlie often felt that it mirrored his own journey, shifting, evolving, yet always moving forward. Visitors who came to see him during these years often found him in his study, surrounded by books, sheet music, and stacks of memories. He welcomed friends, artists, and admirers with the same warmth he'd carried throughout his life. Conversations moved at an unhurried pace. Charlie spoke thoughtfully, often weaving stories from different eras of his life, stories of London's music halls, early Hollywood, the challenges of silent film, and the moments of serendipity that had shaped his career. Even in old age, his humour remained sharp. He could make a room erupt with laughter through a single raised eyebrow or a perfectly timed remark. His timing, the skill that had defined him on screen, still lived within him. Family had become the centre of his world. His younger children often brought him drawings, songs, or questions about his films. They were fascinated by the idea that their gentle, soft-spoken father had once been one of the most famous performers on the planet. Charlie cherished their curiosity, but he never encouraged them to see him as anything more than who he was, a man who loved them deeply, who valued honesty, and who believed wholeheartedly in the importance of simple joys. He watched them grow with quiet pride, finding comfort in their laughter and their everyday discoveries. At times, Charlie reread parts of his autobiography, making small notes in the margins, clarifications, memories, details that had resurfaced with time. Writing about his life had been both a release and a revelation. It helped him understand the threads connecting each stage of his journey, from the difficulties of childhood to the brilliance of his career and the controversies that shaped his exile. He understood now, more than ever, that every chapter had carried him toward the person he became. The world continued to celebrate him in ways he had never expected. Film retrospectives, academic essays, and television programs honoured his work with increasing frequency. Archivists restored his films, bringing new clarity to the images and sounds he had crafted decades earlier. Filmmakers credited him as a foundational influence. Audiences, some seeing his work for the first time, fell in love with the tramp all over again. From his quiet corner of Switzerland, Charlie watched this renewed affection with humility. He had never created films for the sake of legacy. He had created them because he felt compelled to tell stories. Stories of struggle, resilience, humour, and humanity. And now, in the calm of his final years, he saw the beautiful truth. Those stories had found a home in the hearts of millions. As he reflected on it all, Charlie often felt a warmth settle over him, like a soft blanket. He understood that his life had been extraordinary, not because of fame or fortune, but because he had been able to turn his experiences into something meaningful, something that brought comfort and joy to others. And as he prepared to enter the final chapters of his journey, he carried that realization with deep, quiet gratitude. As Charlie stepped further into his later years, his days unfolded with a gentle predictability that brought him a deep, steady comfort. Mornings often began with soft light filtering through the curtains, casting warm shapes across the wooden floors of his home. He moved slowly now, his steps careful but purposeful, and each day he carried a sense of gratitude for the simple fact of being present. Age had thinned his voice and slowed his movements, yet his mind remained bright, filled with memories that played like old films, scenes of stages, laughter, cameras, and the countless faces he had encountered along the way. His home near Lake Geneva became a haven of tranquility. The crisp air, the echo of birds in the distance, and the peaceful rhythm of the nearby village created an atmosphere of quiet reflection. Charlie often sat outside wrapped in a warm blanket, watching the lake ripple gently beneath passing breezes. He enjoyed these moments of stillness, where nature's calmness felt like a balm. Sometimes he hummed melodies to himself, fragments of songs he had composed long ago. Other times he simply closed his eyes, letting the memories drift, the London streets of his childhood, the roaring crowds of early Hollywood, the glow of theatre lights. Although he no longer directed films, Charlie continued observing the world with an artist's eye. He noticed the expressions of people passing through town, the tiny dramas unfolding in everyday life, the sincerity in a stranger's smile. These observations filled him with the same quiet wonder that had once inspired his earliest performances. It reassured him that humanity, in all its complexity, still held beauty worth noticing. His family remained his greatest joy. The laughter of his children echoed through the house like music, and Charlie welcomed it with an open heart. They often gathered around him, eager to share their day, their questions, their discoveries. In those moments, Charlie felt the fullness of a life well lived. He was surrounded not by crowds or cameras, but by love. The kind of love that expected nothing from him except honesty and presence. As letters from admirers continued to arrive, Charlie read them slowly, savouring the kindness in each one. People thanked him for giving them hope during difficult times, for making them laugh when they felt alone, for teaching them that resilience could be gentle. Many wrote that his films felt like old friends, always ready to offer comfort. These messages touched him deeply. They reminded him that while fame had faded long ago, the connection he created through his work still lived on. In the quiet hours of evening, Charlie sometimes revisited his films. He watched the tramp stumble, rise, and continue with unwavering spirit, and he felt a tender affection for the character who had carried so much of his own heart. The tramp seemed almost like a younger version of himself, full of hope, determination, and quiet courage. Seeing him on screen brought Charlie a sense of peace, as if he were reuniting with a part of his soul. Though his health had begun to decline, Charlie faced the changes with grace. He accepted the limitations of age the same way he had accepted the challenges of his youth, with patience, humility, and a touch of humour. He often joked with his family about his slowness or forgetfulness, easing their concerns with laughter. Even in frailty, he carried the same gentle spirit that had defined his life. And as he watched the moon rise over the lake on quiet nights, he felt a profound sense of completion. He understood that his story, filled with struggle, triumph, reinvention, and love, had unfolded exactly as it was meant to. In the calm twilight of his life, Charlie felt ready for whatever came next, holding close the knowledge that he had given the world all he could, and that his work would continue speaking long after he was gone. As the final years of Charlie's life unfolded, time seemed to slow into a gentle, almost dreamlike rhythm. Each day felt like a soft echo of the one before, filled with familiar routines that brought him comfort. Morning tea by the window, quiet walks through the garden with a cane in hand, afternoons spent listening to music or reading aloud to his children. Though his body had grown fragile, his spirit remained steady, filled with the same curiosity and warmth that had defined him from the beginning. Visitors who came to see him during these last years often noted the serene expression he carried, as if he had made peace with every chapter of his story. Charlie welcomed guests with a soft smile, his eyes still bright and full of mischief. He never spoke of fame or achievement. Instead, he asked about their families, their work, their dreams, the simple, human things that had always mattered most to him. When conversations drifted toward his films, he listened with humility, often surprised that scenes he'd created decades earlier still lived vividly in people's minds. He would laugh softly and say he was grateful that the tramp had become a friend to so many. Despite his age, Charlie's creativity flickered gently in the background. Some evenings he picked up a notebook and wrote a line or two, reflections, bits of dialogue, memories that surfaced unexpectedly. He also returned often to music, humming melodies he had composed long ago, or tapping out rhythms on the arm of his chair. Creativity, even in its quietest form, remained part of his daily life, like a familiar heartbeat. Family gatherings were his greatest joy. Holidays and birthdays filled the house with warmth, with children running through hallways and laughter drifting from every room. Charlie watched it all with deep appreciation, grateful that his life, once marked by hardship and loneliness, had grown into one surrounded by love. His wife, Una, became his greatest source of comfort, steady, patient, and deeply devoted. She understood him in a way few ever had, and their bond brought Charlie immense peace. As age progressed, moments of fatigue and fragility became more frequent. Some days were slower, quieter, marked by longer rests and shorter walks. But Charlie faced these changes with grace. He never complained. Instead, he accepted each limitation with the same gentle resilience he had given the tramp, a quiet determination to continue forward, even if the steps were small. In the stillness of the nights, Charlie often reflected on his life. He thought about the boy who once wandered the streets of London, the young performer struggling for a chance, the filmmaker shaping stories through silence, and the man who had weathered storms both public and private. He felt no bitterness about the difficulties he had faced. Instead, he saw them as the threads that had woven his story together, giving it depth, compassion, and purpose. Toward the end, as winter settled over Switzerland, Charlie spent many evenings by the fire, wrapped in a blanket, his breathing slow and peaceful. His family stayed close, offering quiet presence rather than words. They knew that the man who had given the world so much laughter was nearing his final curtain call. And yet, even in these final days, Charlie radiated a sense of contentment. He had lived, created, loved, endured, and inspired. He had transformed silence into a universal language and given the world a character who embodied hope. As he drifted into the final chapter of his extraordinary life, Charlie carried with him the quiet satisfaction of someone who had filled the world with kindness and left it brighter than he found it. Charlie's final chapter unfolded with the same gentle grace that had defined so much of his life. As the last days of December 1977 approached, his home in Switzerland felt warm and peaceful, filled with quiet routines and the soft hum of family life. His children moved carefully through the house, speaking in tender tones, aware of the fragile rhythm of their father's breathing. Una stayed close by his side, offering comfort with her presence alone. Even in his weakened state, Charlie carried a look of calm acceptance. He had lived fully, loved deeply, and created with every ounce of sincerity he possessed. In the evenings, he still sat near the window when he could, wrapped in blankets, watching the snow settle across the garden and the mountain peaks beyond. Winter had always held a special beauty for him. Its stillness felt like a gentle pause, a moment suspended in time. Sometimes he closed his eyes and listened to the distant sounds of his family talking or laughing in another room. Those sounds brought him comfort. They were proof that his life had grown into something far more meaningful than fame or recognition. It had grown into love, stability, and warmth, things he once thought were out of reach. In his final days, Charlie seemed to drift between present moments and long memories. At times he whispered short recollections to Una, a stage he once performed on in London, a funny mishap on a film set, a moment during a premiere when he felt the audience breathe as one. These memories surfaced gently, like soft waves returning to shore. His children often gathered around him, sitting quietly, holding his hands or leaning against his chair. They didn't need words. Their presence alone filled the room with peace. Charlie sensed their love, and even when he was too tired to speak, he squeezed their hands in acknowledgement. Outside, the winter nights grew long. Snow blanketed the world in silence, a silence that felt almost fitting for a man who had built his entire art from the beauty of quiet expression. And in the early hours of Christmas Day, as the world slept and the soft glow of holiday lights shimmered faintly in distant windows, Charlie Chaplin passed away in his sleep. There was no struggle, no dramatic moment, only a peaceful drifting, as gentle as a closing curtain. News of his death spread across the globe with profound sadness. People from every country, every background, and every generation felt the loss of someone who had shaped their understanding of laughter and compassion. Tributes poured in from filmmakers, actors, world leaders, and fans who had grown up watching the tramp stumble, rise, and continue with courage. They spoke of his genius, his heart, and the way he transformed silent film into an art form that still touched lives decades later. But beyond all the praise, one truth stood out. Charlie had given the world a unique gift, the reminder that humanity, in all its fragility, carries an unbreakable spark of resilience. His characters lived with simplicity, sincerity, and hope, and through them he taught millions that even small gestures could hold deep emotion, that humour could heal, and that kindness could transcend words. As years passed, Charlie's legacy only grew stronger. His films continued to be restored, studied, and adored by new generations. The tramp walked on, timeless and universal, forever carrying the gentle courage of the man who created him. And though Charlie left the world quietly, the warmth he shared remained bright, an enduring light that continues to shine across screens, hearts, and the ever-changing landscape of cinema.